Before we see how indirect costs are tracked in a job order costing system, let's first review indirect costs for a manufacturer, also known as manufacturing overhead. Remember, all product costs are either direct costs like direct materials and direct labor, or indirect costs. Indirect costs are costs that cannot be easily and cost-effectively traced to a cost object. These include factory rent, factory depreciation, and maintenance of the factory, amongst others. These are all costs that are necessary to make cars for an automobile manufacturer or to make guitars for Gabriella's guitar shop. Notice we have one category of indirect costs, manufacturing overhead. Manufacturing overhead consists of costs that cannot be easily and cost-effectively traced to a cost object. Remember, a cost object for an automobile manufacturer is an automobile, and a cost object for Gabriella's guitar shop is the guitar. It's important to note that manufacturing overhead includes all manufacturing costs except direct materials and direct labor. We can further break down manufacturing overhead into three categories: indirect materials, indirect labor, and all other manufacturing overhead. Indirect materials are raw materials used in production that are difficult or not cost-effective to trace to a particular product. Examples for Gabriella's guitar shop are glue and small tools. One bottle of glue is used to make many guitars, and it's not cost-effective to measure the number of drops of glue it takes to build each guitar. Likewise, small hand tools are used to make numerous guitars, so their cost is classified as indirect materials, which of course is part of manufacturing overhead, and in turn, an indirect cost. Another category of manufacturing overhead is indirect labor, which is the cost of labor in the factory for people who do not directly produce the product. Gabriella's examples are the factory janitor and the factory supervisor. All other indirect product costs that would be included in manufacturing overhead would be factory rent, factory depreciation, maintenance of the factory, etc. Now that we've reviewed manufacturing overhead, let's see how Gabriella's guitar shop would handle the cost of indirect materials. On May 30th, Willie the woodworker notices that he has run out of glue. So he requisitions $5 of glue from raw materials to use on the factory floor. Because the glue will be used in many different jobs, the cost of the glue is an indirect cost. And because it's a material, it's considered more specifically indirect materials. Recall that indirect costs are part of an account called manufacturing overhead. Manufacturing overhead is not an asset account. Manufacturing overhead is a temporary account used to accumulate costs. It falls under the equity classification and is treated like an expense. This means it increases on the debit side, it normally has a debit balance, and it decreases equity. What we will do with this account is to accumulate actual manufacturing overhead costs on the debit side. So this is important. The debit side are actual manufacturing overhead costs. These are costs like indirect materials, like the glue, indirect labor, like the factory janitor, factory depreciation, factory utilities, factory insurance, factory property tax, etc. These are all the factory costs that cannot be directly traced to a job. Then as jobs are finished, we will credit the manufacturing overhead costs to lower it and allocate the manufacturing overhead to specific jobs based on the job size so that each job gets its share of manufacturing overhead costs. So remember, debiting manufacturing overhead means you're accumulating actual overhead costs. And when we credit manufacturing overhead, we are lowering the manufacturing overhead account and allocating those costs to a particular job based on the job size. Now back to our example. Willie the woodworker removes $5 of glue from the storeroom, which is the raw materials inventory account. This means raw materials inventory decreases by $5. And because the glue is an indirect material, that means it's a manufacturing overhead cost. Thus, manufacturing overhead costs increase with a debit because the $5 is an actual cost. The journal entry would be a debit to manufacturing overhead, which again is a temporary expense and it's increasing, and a credit to raw materials, which is an asset account and it's decreasing. Now it's time to record the salaries of the factory supervisor and factory janitor. These costs are classified as indirect labor, which is part of manufacturing overhead. Let's say the combined salaries of the factory supervisor and factory janitor was $2,000. Since indirect labor is part of manufacturing overhead, we would debit manufacturing overhead $2,000 to accumulate actual overhead costs. Notice I've added a section below the blue box breaking down what the individual manufacturing debits are in case you forget and are wondering where they came from. So the journal entry for these salaries would be a debit to manufacturing overhead to increase this temporary expense account and a credit to wages payable, a liability increasing.